All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be continuing our series looking at Bilal Philips's manual on how to do Dawa. Today we are going to be looking at a section which he calls general considerations for doing Dawa, but in reality it is all how to respond to common criticisms of Islam. So let me get us started with a word of prayer as my cat tries to knock over my light. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to reach people around the world. Islam has largely lived in a bubble for the last 1,300 years, whereby most Muslims never have any contact with Christians, never hear any ideas that differ from their own. But that's changing now, thanks to the technology we have. And we know that as Muslims learn the truth, many will reject Islam, and we just hope that they come to you instead. We ask anyone listening today get something out of it, that any Muslims who watch this presentation approach the material with an open mind, and that the Christians use this material to better reach Muslims. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So as I said, we're going to be looking at Bilal Philips' manual. It's called Dawah Training. We're going to be looking at some issues and his incredibly weak defenses of them. We'll start with polygamy because that's what he has first. We'll go through some detail on that one just to give you an idea of how to respond, and then we'll have somewhat less detail on the rest. Do you want to say anything, Lloyd, to get us started?
I think we're good. Yeah, thanks guys for joining us, and hopefully you will gain a lot out of this, understand the training, in fact, the indoctrination that Muslims are given, the very, very, I don't know if that is a weak defense, a genuinely bizarre series of defenses that they use to try to teach Muslims to defend Islam. And yeah, hopefully you will be able to use this compassionately to speak to Muslims and to show them just how false these arguments are, how weak these are, and show them a better way. So,
excellent. Yeah. So while you're pulling up the PowerPoint, I will briefly summarize what we talked about in the previous two episodes. If you haven't watched those, don't worry. Nothing that we covered in those is necessary to understand today's material, but you may want to check them out later. The first one, we just looked at what is Dawa, characteristics of people doing Dawa, and found that Bilal greatly distorted the meaning of Quran verses, quoted some really strange hadith that they didn't really seem to support his point, or they supported something different than what he was saying, and he just kind of pretended like it all worked together. Then the second episode, we looked at the characteristics of the called, the person who the Muslim is trying to reach when they do the dawah. And we saw how Bilal is subtly teaching the Muslim reading his manual how to manipulate people, get them isolated one-on-one, just do a little bit at a time, don't give them too much information. He says that rhetoric, good speech is more important than factual information. You can use facts if you need to, but what's really important is that you give a good presentation, that you project confidence and stuff like that. Then at the very end of that section, he defines a number of terms. A lot of the definitions are fairly standard, but on really important terms that are come up often in Christian Muslim dialogue, or just non-Muslim Muslim dialogue in general, he redefines the terms in such a way that he can be saying one thing and you'll think he means something that sounds okay, but he actually means something completely different. Just to point out one of the more egregious examples, he redefines pedophilia as paying for sex with minors. So that it's only pedophilia, apparently, if you pay for it. You can abuse children as much as you want, and it's not pedophilia unless you pay them.
Yeah, that was horrible. On this point, there was this really, really good discussion with David Wood and Jay Smith. Very long discussion, but a very interesting discussion about the Quran. But they obviously featured Yasir Qadi talking to Muhammad Ijab, and Muhammad Ijab was asking Yasir Qadi questions he didn't want to answer. And Yasir Qadi says to Muhammad Ijab, I could use Tawriya, but I won't use Tawriya. I'd rather say nothing. And I find it very interesting that he brings up the idea of using a form of Islamic deception to use on Muhammad Ijab and the Islamic audience that are listening, which implies that the master scholars are utilizing deception to mislead their own people. And Tawriya is deceit by ambiguity. You might call it lying by omission, to leave out something pertinent, to leave out something relevant, to quote half of a statement for argument's sake. So this is very interesting that he admits that they do utilize Tawriya on their own people.
Yeah, pretty crazy. Actually, the video I am working on currently, since you brought up the subject, I'm going to call it Ignorance and Censorship, the two pillars of Islamic scholarship. It's going to look at Qadi's comments and also comments by other Muslim scholars in recent times about how it's best not to tell the people anything. And then, of course, I show how the Hadith, Quran, and the Sharia law back this same opinion in the video.
Yeah, we've discussed it over the last few weeks where the Sharia explains Muslims should not know too much and should not ask, else they will lose faith. And after that discussion, Muslims were losing their faith. So yeah, anything further? Else we can.
Nope, I think we can go ahead and dive in.
Okay, so I should share that screen. Okay, so that's Dawa Part 3.
Just a reminder to go ahead and put any comments or questions you have in the chat. We will try to pay attention to the live chat as we're able. I'm not super talented. I can't talk and read at the same time, but I'll check it periodically.
Yeah, welcome to all. I see we've got comments from London and Pinpoint from Holland. So yes, welcome all. Okay, let's begin then.
All right, so as I already previewed, the first issue here is polygamy. He spends quite a lot of time talking about polygamy. And so we'll just look at some of his excuses or points, however you want to refer to them, and see why they, some cases are outright false, other cases are true but irrelevant, and how none of them really defend Islam at all when you look at the reality of the situation. So number one is that Islam did not introduce polygamy. It's factually true. Polygamy existed before Islam, but of course, lots of things existed before Islam. Murder existed before Islam. Are you saying that murder should be allowed because it existed before Islam? Theft existed before Islam. Rape existed before Islam. All kinds of things existed before Islam. So this is a totally irrelevant point.
Also, his framing of the question is false or misleading because they're not only accused of being promiscuous due to multiple marriage, it's also because of the slaves that your right hand possess, which is an issue that he completely just avoids.
Yeah, and you know, that's a good point because he's saying that Muslims are being accused of being promiscuous. You know, someone might phrase it that way, but I would just say that you're violating the intent of marriage by having multiple partners, that you're not treating it the way God intended. I wouldn't even go there with being promiscuous. So he's trying to frame it so that he can say, well, you know, a lot of Westerners are promiscuous in other ways.
And also his language, again, he says unrestricted polygamy is practiced in most human societies. So, you know, he doesn't say is or was. So it may have been, but really provides no examples. And it has certainly been in the Western world. It is essentially no longer present, right? Now, he says Islam regulated polygamy. So in other words, they certainly do, but they regulated it by limiting the number of wives and establishing responsibility. Um, Sorry, I lost my thread on that. But the fact that it may have been unrestricted in the past does not mean that it is okay now, because they're still doing it now.
And actually, this goes with a lot of what we've talked about over this apologetics series, that Islam is all about what's legal, not what's right. So, you make polygamy legal, and that's all that matters. You could do the same with any crime. You can greatly reduce the amount of crime just by making a bunch of things legal. That
And
doesn't
also,
actually fix the problem. It just changes the definition of whether it's legal or not.
they don't arrive at the permission of polygamy on the basis of rational thinking. Yes, they may try and justify it after the fact. They may try to rationalize, but A, it's in the Quran, Allah allows it, and B, Muhammad certainly did it. Muhammad had 22 wives over his entire period, over his entire career. So he had up to 11 or 12 at a single moment. So therefore, they have to justify it. It's not like they came to a rational, line of decisions. They simply said, well, we have to do it because Islam.
Yeah. So moving on to number 2, he says that monogamy was inherited from Greece and Rome, but where people could have as many mistresses as they wanted. Well, first of all, that is false. The Jewish ideal was always one wife, so Christianity inherits it from Judaism, not Greek and Roman society. But I think this is actually very interesting, because actually, when you look at all the cultures around the world, most actually did value monogamy. So him saying that polygamy was always the norm isn't even true. Here, it apparently was inherited from the pagan Greek and Roman society, according to Bilal. So apparently it wasn't normal there. And then he goes on to say that even today, most married men have extramarital relations. I don't know what the percent is. I doubt it's most, but even if it is most, that is completely irrelevant. We don't decide what is right by what the majority of people do.
Also, that is not polygamy. That is a breaking of your marital vows and your contract with the state, if you want to view marriage in that sense as well. And so relationship with a mistress, that's cheating, girlfriend and prostitute. And in Islam, he fails to discuss the fact that there's the mutta marriage in Islam, where you can have literally marry a girl for 1 hour just so you can take her to a hotel room. And then afterwards, the imam will divorce the two of you and you pay them both some money.
Yeah, it's prostitution in all but name. It's exactly the same format that, you pay money, you get sex. It's they call it marriage, but it's obviously not.
So yeah, and the concept of the Western claim to monogamy is false. Our laws, our entire morality, our entire legal system, the ethical system, the religious system, it is monogamous. Now, you can break those laws, but breaking those laws is not an example of the law. That's an example of a violation. So just really false set of ideas he presents.
Plus, which is one more thing, he only talks about men, but of course, Western women also have multiple boyfriends and over their lifetimes, and often cheat on their husbands. So apparently, he doesn't care about that side of the coin, because he only wants to justify men having multiple wives. But his argument could just as easily be used for women having multiple husbands.
Yeah.
So that,
Sorry. Go.
The point number 3 here, he claims that monogamy is illogical, and again, it's basically the same argument. He says that people violate their monogamous marriages, and they get in trouble for doing that. But if we just made it legal, then they wouldn't get in trouble for doing it. It's pretty bizarre argument.
Yeah, it's just the way he twists words, and the way you've got to spend so much time untangling this that it's really just designed to create this morass that you're trapped in before you can clear all these cobwebs and landmines and then get to the actual point. It's a mental trap that he's laying here for themselves, for his the people he's supposed to be guiding, and for anyone who wants to try and refute him. It's really incredible thinking, the lack thereof that we're seeing.
Pinpoint says that Islam is men-oriented, and actually we're going to see that most of these issues that Bilal chooses to address are male-female relationships, and in a lot of cases he just flat out says Islam is right, women are inferior. So you're quite right about that point. So point number 4, he says men created I guess he means men were created polygamous because of a need in human society. There's normally a surplus of women in most human societies. Then he goes on to try to connect this to homosexuality, which is both bizarre and expected. He seems very obsessed with homosexuality. He's brought it up multiple times already in the Dawa manual, where it had no point whatsoever being brought up. And I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, you know, those Westerners, those Christians, they're really immoral people, so who cares what they think anyway? But his point about there being a surplus of women in most human societies, one, is false. As we'll bring up some population statistics here in a second. But the reason it was historically true is because men often went to war and died in war. So because of that, there were more women. However, it wasn't a massive imbalance because women also were very likely to die during childbirth. Nowadays, it's very rare for a woman to die in childbirth, but in the old times, it was quite common. So women also often died prematurely in those days. So there was, there was a slight imbalance, but there certainly was never a 4-to-1 imbalance like Islam allows for.
Yeah.
And
were men created polygamous, or was Muhammad just a rampant sex maniac?
Very good question. Yeah, you're right. He just kind of assumes that that's the natural way of men as being polygamous, which apparently women, not so much, just only men, apparently.
Also, it's very carnal. He doesn't speak about disciplining your drive. I mean, you can be the most alpha of males, and when you're unmarried, maybe have your choice of women, because women might be throwing themselves at you if you're the quarterback or whatever. But once you find your wife, you settle down, that's it. You know, you are no longer polygamous. You are now bound to one person, and he's saying we discipline in the West. We discipline those drives. Yes, we can look at a woman and appreciate her beauty. However, we discipline that, and he's making excuses for why they don't have to discipline themselves in Islam.
And then he raises this. So he does raise the war reason, and then he gives 2 other reasons which are less true. Men dying in violent crime. I'm sure men are more likely to die in violent crime, but if you're talking like 0.01% of the population or something, it's not going to create an imbalance. And then women outliving men, which is factually true. Women do have a longer life expectancy. But let's be real here. No one is taking a 80-year-old widow as their second wife. They're taking a 14-year-old virgin as their second wife. So, all those old women who Bilal is trying to make us feel sympathetic for because their husbands have died of old age, they are not getting remarried, regardless of polygamy or not.
Right. Yeah, the rest, read through that, but we won't go into every sentence here.
Did you have those population statistics?
Yeah, those will pop up now. Those will be popping up now.
So he cites here Russia, 46% male, UK, 48% male, US, 49% male, and then Brazil, almost exactly 50-50. And I guess these are the best examples he could find. But actually in most, well, I don't know about most, but in a large percentage of countries, and certainly in almost all Muslim countries, men outnumber women.
Yeah. He gives these excuses as well. Western anthropologists say that polygamy is a genetic trait. Again, he's basically stating they're animals, they can't control themselves. So if this is what they're being taught, well, does this help us to explain the issues we're seeing in Western Europe, where all these Islamic migrants come in? Because they're told they don't have, it's not their fault. They can't control themselves. Yeah, he gives these statistics, but notice he doesn't provide statistics for the Middle East. And here are some modern statistics that we dug up. I think these are recent. These are fairly recent. So Ireland has 101. This is the ratio of men to women. So you can see these ratios are very, very even. So where is the 4-to-1 ratio? If every man in Islam had to have 4 women, how are there enough women to allow for this? I mean, this is obviously some kind of way that the people in authority who have the money, and those were Muhammad's followers, these companions, they could have multiple wives as a reward for their service. That was more of, I don't think it's something that any average man can do. How can you afford it? And he says even that it causes major issues in relationship. It causes problems from financial to psychological issues.
Yeah, we see here that these Middle Eastern countries, however, are quite an exception to the norm. And just to be clear, that first number is the number of females and the second is the number of males. So there's almost a 2-to-1 or even greater than a 2-to-1 ratio of males to females in some of these countries.
Yeah, Qatar 48 to 100, UAE 47 women to 100 men.
And, you know, China gets this rap, and it is true in parts of China, of people aborting their female babies, or, you know, giving them up for adoption, or even killing them after they've been born. But China is 95 to 100. Here we see in Qatar, 48 to 100, United Arab Emirates, 47 to 100. So even though I've never heard anyone in the news talk about how the Middle Eastern countries are aborting their female babies, clearly they are. That's the only explanation.
They're also exporting their excess males, because excess males without partners also become a social issue. That aggression, that violence, it plays out in society. So they're actually exporting all of their excess males to Europe.
And if we take Bilal's argument seriously here, this seems to be pretty clear evidence that women should be allowed to have multiple husbands, not the other way around. So his argument ends up blowing up in his face.
Yeah, why do men outnumber the women? Oh, the women outnumber the men. I have no idea. I mean, what do the men outnumber the women so much? 2-to-1, basically. Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah, there's some chat in the comments about that, and you know, I don't have another explanation other than that they're aborting the females. They're certainly not occurring naturally. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, those are crazy numbers, how the statistics are so heavily skewed in their society.
So going on here, he claims that polygamy protects the interests of women and children in society. And this ends up being quite a sexist argument here, that he says because men make the laws, that women need the protection of polygamy. Otherwise, the men will make laws that allow them to, you know, just have children without having to pay for them, kind of thing. So he apparently thinks that women are incapable of protecting themselves. They need this polygamous relationship to protect them. Then moving on to point number 8, he claims that only a minority will practice polygamy even in Muslim societies, which I'm sure is probably true, but it's totally irrelevant. If you're saying only a minority will do it, well, great. Only a minority of people are going to steal from their neighbor. Does that have any relevance to whether it should be legal or not, or whether it is moral or not? It's just a total non-starter. And then he even admits that family problems and marital disputes are multiplied in plural marriages, meaning polygamous marriages. So he ends up giving an argument why you shouldn't have a polygamous marriage. So why exactly is he arguing that there's no problem here? I don't get it.
Yeah, he says there are psychological burdens of handling more than one wife. It's, yeah, he starts to talk about issues. really, this is something new for us as well, that we're learning to understand this, but these are the ideas that they're bringing with them. And if we don't know what they are, we cannot challenge them, because they're bringing these ideas to the West. They're setting up this within their culture. We need to start having these conversations and learning to, just as we do apologetics and polemics against their religion, their culture is also very much bound up with religion. We need to be able to discuss this intelligently as well.
If you could go back a slide, we accidentally skipped over number 6 because we had the population stats popped up over the top of it. He claims that polygamy prevents the spread of STDs. Maybe he thinks that it would be the case. Intuitively, it seems plausible that it could be the case. However, I went ahead and did something that is totally contrary to the way a Muslim works and did some actual research. And I found a scientific paper addressing that exact question, which I'm going to pull up here. This is a paper called Concurrent Partnerships and the Spread of HIV. So it's HIV specific, but it would presumably apply to any STD. And then here in the results, it says concurrent partnerships exponentially increase the number of affected individuals and the growth rate of the epidemic since its initial phase. For example, when 1/2 of partnerships in the population are concurrent, i.e. equivalent to polygamous, whether it's recognized as a marriage or not, the size of the epidemic after 5 years is 10 times as large as under sequential monogamy. So even if a culture that practices monogamy ends up having the same number of total partners over their lifetime, the disease will spread much faster with the concurrent relations created by polygamy. So, he just asserts something. He doesn't have any reason to believe it's true. And then when we look at the actual data, the data says that if the opposite is actually true, that having concurrent partners, even if it doesn't increase the total number of partners, increases the spread of STDs.
Yeah.
So we can go ahead and go on to number 9.
That would be, yeah. There we go.
So then number 9, it seems like he's providing a reason why polygamy is not so bad, because he says conditions have been added for polygamy in many Muslim countries. For example, in Egypt, the permission of the first wife must be obtained. However, he then argues against this. He says that this is like colonial domination. No woman in her right mind would give her husband permission for a second wife. That's a pretty good clue why you shouldn't have a second wife. And then he says such a condition negates the permission given by God in the Quran. So he says no woman in her right mind would agree to this, but Allah says it's okay.
Yeah, and she should then have no say by implication. He's saying she should have no say. And even though Allah is quite happy to upset the wife, and the man can just impose his will like that. This is insane. So yeah, but he kind of phrases this as if it's a defense, but yet it's actually a complaint.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. I don't know why he would throw that in there. It's like, oh, polygamy's not so bad. They've restricted it, but they shouldn't have. That God's against that. Allah's against that.
Yeah, so no woman in her right mind will give her husband permission, but this goes against the will of Allah and thus the will of men.
So I guess the only implication here is that Allah doesn't care about what any woman in her right mind would want. He only cares about what a man wants.
Yeah, so why would Allah care that men have multiple sexual partners?
Good question.
I thought Islam was all about the virtue of marriage and, saving yourself and not having rampant sex. But it seems really, really Allah's interested in men having as many sexual partners as they can manage.
Yeah, and even the Islamic conception of paradise is all about sex. sex for men anyway.
It's
The
like
women's
Mohammed.
needs are an afterthought if they're there at all. Going on to number 10, we see the same pattern here that, others have accepted polygamy as on condition it's not for lust. Okay, that sounds reasonable enough, that you can only marry a second woman, if you actually care about her and whatnot. Blah, blah, blah. But then he says the reality is that lust was involved in the first marriage of the first wife. Why is it acceptable in the case of the first and not the second? I'm married. I did not get married because I was lusting after my wife. I got married to her because I cared about her and I wanted to be with her and her only. So this is just a really interesting thing here.
And he also states that he then goes on to contradict this very point as we go through this discussion, because he says marriages are arranged. You might not have even seen or met your wife. You might not even know what she looks like, to be quite honest. But also, marriages, he says, are not about love. It's about just a contractual obligation, which says you're now allowed to have sex. So really, it's just legal permission to have sex. So it's often, I don't know, does that make real sense that it's about lust and love? No, it's just about, okay, well, I need to marry them off. And often they marry them off because of business reasons, because of wealth or whatever, or there's some kind of cultural conditions. But it's not about, oh, I see the woman, I fell in love, I'm going for that one. No, because that's not allowed.
Yeah, and then this last sentence here is pretty telling too. He says to try to curb it by some conditions will only lead to corruption in society. So he basically says that men are going to lust after women no matter what. So you might as well let them marry multiple wives so that they can fulfill their lusts on their property, i.e. their wives. It's it's pretty telling about what Islam's all about here. It's all about what is legal. You define something as legal, and then it's right. If you're lusting after a woman and you have sex with her outside of marriage, that is wrong because it's defined as legally not allowed. But if you marry her first, and keep in mind that she doesn't necessarily have to really give her permission. Her permission's probably irrelevant, as Bilal will defend later. Then it's perfectly okay. You don't have to care about her. You can just use her as a sex toy, and that's perfectly fine as long as you have a contractual marriage in place.
Yeah, it's hard for me to make sense of some of this. It just goes against reason, goes against anything that seems like natural law. It's hard to wrap my head around some of this.
Yeah, it's pretty disgusting. I was discussing with my wife what the topic of today's live stream would be last night, and I was like, if you want to be infuriated, tune in today, because we're going to be talking about women's rights issues mostly, and Bilal basically just says the Quran says it, so it's correct. That's all that matters. Women can be treated like property. It's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, yeah, no, I don't know what to say. It's just, this is horrifying. The more we go through it, the worse it gets.
So I'll take a couple comments from the chat real quick here. Pinpoint says that Muhammad scolded a man who married a widow and said he should have been marrying a virgin. That is correct. There's a hadith that says that, which goes back to the point about Bilal saying that women live longer is totally irrelevant because widows are undesirable and no one wants to marry them anyway. And Muhammad said you shouldn't want to marry them. JC was talking a little bit about English-speaking sheikhs like Yasser Qadi and Bilal Philips. He says, that they're clearly educated, and in some senses they're more honest than a lot of the more popular level of apologists are, and that is true. But then he says, but in the end, they have to defend Islam, and that's what they do, which is absolutely correct. So, we can point to someone like Qadi admitting that Islam did not spread by peaceful means, that is a myth, and he'll actually scold Muslims for repeating that myth, saying that when people learn the truth, then they want to leave Islam because they've been lied to. But the vast majority of Muslims are going to just keep lying anyway. I touch on this in my upcoming video, that basically there's a few people like sometimes like Bilal Philips, often like Yasser Qadi, Shabir Ali, a few others that are somewhat honest, that, you know, talk about what Islam really teaches, and even scold Muslims who try to pretend that it meets with Western values. But the majority are just going to keep lying because most people aren't going to look into things for themselves. And a nice sounding lie is more convenient than the truth.
Yeah, I'm going to state here that he mentions that some of these scholars have their differences. Now, to some degree, there's a difference within each of the four schools of jurisprudence, as well as the schools of their creeds that they belong to. However, as we've seen from Yasser Qadi, they also tell the Muslims that listen to them, or even the Christians that listen to them, whatever is convenient at the time. So some of those differences are really just propaganda they're making up to make you happy at that point. However, if you want to find what the actual rules are, you have to read the Sharia and go through the tafsir of the major scholars. That tells you that's what it is in black and white. You know, that's where the rubber meets the road. And we can't always believe what they tell us. I mean, this is garbage. This is garbage. And if we just read through the Sharia, we'd see it bluntly laid out for us.
So then he continues on here with point number 11, saying that feminists, or as he previously called them, any woman in her right mind, would object to this male right by insisting women should be able to practice polygamy as well. However, a woman marrying 4 husbands would only increase the problem of surplus women. Of course, as we've already seen, that isn't actually the reality. Globally, it's pretty darn close to 50-50. And in the most prominent Islamic countries, there's a surplus of men. So this is a total nonsense argument. And then he says, furthermore, no child would accept his mother identifying the father by the eeny, meeny, miny, mo method, which we could just flip that around. No child would accept his father identifying the mother by the eeny, meeny, miny, mo method.
That's an irrelevant sentence. I mean, that's just an opinion. And also, when he speaks of the problem that having 4 husbands would increase the problem of surplus women, how do they? Sorry, no, it's just they already have a problem with too few women. Maybe because many of those women, the 10 or 15% of men who've removed those surplus, those extra women from the marriage pool, maybe that's why there is a shortage in those countries. You know, they've removed that, and yeah, I don't know. It just makes so little sense to me. It's nothing. I don't think it's something we've sat down. We've talked about the Quran. We've talked about this and that and the Hadith, but this is, it's just gobbledygook. It's not rational. It's not logical, and it's something new for us. And we're trying to make sense of this. And I'm hoping that others will also pick up this, look at this, and start taking apart these arguments and start discussing this on online forums and with Muslims, and start saying, hold on, like, just someone be clear with me. Where is this coming from? And, you know, these are just assertions that Bilal is making. Again, it's assertion after assertion.
And then point number 12, he ends up, after giving all of these arguments or non-arguments as they may really be, he ends up saying, basically, the Quran says it, Allah says it, so it must be correct. And his final sentence here on this subject is quite disgusting. He says, if a certain legislation benefits the majority of society and causes some emotional harm to a minority, the general welfare of society is given preference. So let's decode that here. He's agreeing that polygamy causes emotional harm to women, and he's saying it doesn't matter. They're in the minority. Their rights don't matter. This is the exact same argument anyone could give for any kind of discrimination whatsoever.
Well, let's reinterpret that. He says if a certain legislation benefits the majority of the society. So who is the majority of society in the Muslim countries? Men. literally the majority, and causes some emotional harm to a minority. So who's the minority? Women. Then the general wealth of this society is given preference to the men. Well, hey, your luck.
Yeah, and let you could go a lot of different places with this here, but let's just do it a way that it, is important to Muslims. In the United States, Muslims are roughly 0.8 to 1% of the population. That is a pretty obviously clear minority. So if we pass a law that benefits the other 99% of society, say uh, outlawing wearing the hijab in public, or outlawing fundamentalist Islamic preaching, such as, say, Zakir Naik, make it illegal to watch Zakir Naik in the United States. That might cause some emotional harm to that 1% of the population, but hey, it benefits the other 99%. So by Bilal's argument, it's perfectly fine.
You put it like that.
So then we go on to the next issue, which I believe is arranged marriage. Now, this title is a little deceptive because what he's really talking about isn't really arranged marriage where two families marry off their children. It's where a man picks the woman he wants and her father gives the permission, not her. So it's arranged on one side of the equation anyway. But just keep that in mind. That's what he's really talking about. So point number one, Islamic law requires that females must give their permission before they can be married. And then he stupidly goes on to quote the hadith about what that means. The permission of virgins should be taken and their silence is consent. So, you're a 12-year-old girl, you living with your family, and your father says you have to marry this 18 or 21-year-old man, which is a very common situation in Islamic countries. What are you going to do? You're going to disrespect your father and say no, or are you just going to be silent? You're probably just going to be silent. And if you're not silent, there's a good chance you're going to be beaten or subjected to emotional abuse. So this is just really disgusting. Imagine in a Western context, someone has been accused of raping a woman, and he goes to the judge. Well, she didn't say no. I didn't ask her permission, but she didn't say no. Do you think that's a good defense?
No, 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 I don't think so. That's not acceptable whatsoever. It's disgusting. I mean, I'm at loss for words sometimes. I really am. I'm just at a loss for words sometimes.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of this material is quite infuriating. It's bad enough that Islam teaches these things, but then Bilal's defense of them is even worse.
These are new to us. I mean, how does one deal with something? Because we're learning how to deal with this. And I mean, this is something just I thought I'd just pop on the screen here. Muhammad was a womanizer, and this is written in Tabari, right? I've come to offer myself in marriage to you, so marry me. And then he replied, I accept. And this is a woman called Layla bint al-Khatam, or whatever. She went to Muhammad and said, okay, she's a great idea. I'm the daughter of blah, blah, blah. Layla bint al-Khatam, I've come to offer. And Muhammad accepts. They said, what a bad thing. She went and tells people that he'd agreed to marriage. These people tell her, what a bad thing you have done. You are a self-respecting woman, right? But the Prophet is a womanizer. Seek an annulment. Why would Muhammad's community, and this is in the history of Tabari, why would they say wanting to marry Muhammad is a very bad thing? He's a womanizer. Get away from him. This is what we're dealing with. This is the man that they idolize, and this is the man who spawned these crazy ideas.
Yeah, it's just really crazy stuff. Even, it would be hard to create a religion where its own scriptures show how false it is more obviously than Islam does. Every point that a Muslim will bring up you don't even have to go to any non-Muslim sources. Just go to the Muslim sources and show them what they say, and they directly contradict what they believe in most all cases. And then they'll say, that's a fake source or that's a weak source or whatever. But some Muslim wrote it. It wasn't a Christian who wrote that Muhammad's a womanizer. A Muslim wrote that. Al-Tabri wrote that. He's well respected. He's one of the top scholars of Islam in history. And Muslims like, oh, that's a fake source. Tabri's not reliable. Then what is? Anyway, getting back to our arranged marriage here. Point number 2 is that women are spared of having to look for their own mates. How generous of Islam. Women don't have to go put in all that effort to find someone. They just told who to marry.
Well, women are incapable, right?
I guess.
They're incapable. So, well, we'll do it for you. Just sit there and we'll decide for you. Where are the feminists on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. In at least here in the United States, most people who are feminists also are supporters of Islam. It's really bizarre.
Yeah. And then it says it's become a practice among some Muslims to force children to marry their cousins. But Muhammad married 2 cousins. His first wife was his maternal cousin. So this is Sunnah.
Yeah. Sorry. Well, this is another one where you think he's going to condemn this, but then he actually ends up saying it's a good thing. Because he says for Muslims in the West, this becomes a means to help their family members also reach the West. Yay, they married their cousins.
So they're practicing incest. I wonder, do you think there are any congresswomen in the US that may have done something like that?
I don't know.
Heard of any? I'm just wondering, just wondering if there's anyone that might have married their brother to bring their family over, just sheer curiosity. But also, when I lived in the UAE and I lived in the Middle East for just under 11 years, 10 years and 6 months, there was an issue. So something started, the laws changed in the Gulf at the very least. For instance, in the UAE, you had to have a mandatory blood and genetic test before getting married. The reason being that quite literally the inbreeding, the cousin marriage was causing birth defects and was causing some serious genetic issues, and a blood disease or genetic damage disease called thalassemia was becoming a serious problem in the Gulf Muslim population. So now in many of these countries and districts, you are required to do a genetic match test to see if it's legal for you to marry based on that, which means that actually this marriage of cousins actually has severe medical consequences, and it causes some serious genetic damage.
Yeah. And then it goes on. Like I said, you think that he was bringing this up as a condemnation, but in fact, he's bringing it up to support it, because it goes on to say there are also many Muslim girls who run away from home rather than being forced to marry relatives in Pakistan and India. Such girls will lose their Islam in the process. So he's saying it is bad for Muslim girls not to marry their cousins.
So it's better to have a forced marriage than have a girl run away and leave Islam. That's insane. Don't they have the freedom to choose what they want to believe?
Yeah, it's insane. We have a couple comments from the chat. End Time says, on top of that, they, I believe, meaning feminists, will get angry with you for letting them know. So true. Pinpoint says women are half-brained according to Islam. We're going to get to that one in a minute, so don't worry, we'll get to talk about that again. JC says that he has a suggestion for helping us. By all means, send that along. And then Pinpoint answered your not so veiled question about who the U.S. Congresswoman who did that was. That would be Ilhan Omar.
Yeah.
And then he added that Islam is allowed in Islam because of Mohammed, and that is quite true, unfortunately. He decided to marry the wife of his own adopted son.
Yeah. JC just posted a new comment, learn the main four schools of thought. We've actually done what, probably 10, a dozen shows on the Sharia, that is. So
Yeah,
JC, if you go back, we've done shows, myself, Thaddeus, and even Sonia Azam, there's one or two on her channel. We've done numerous shows discussing the Sharia in depth. And I quote from multiple different manuals from different schools, although not every school has necessarily, certain schools have dominance in certain subjects, so their books are the ones that are used. So the Shafi'i school generally is what is dominant, and then in certain subjects you might lean towards a different manual for a certain topic. But yeah, we
and
feature that. Yeah.
yeah, and I have to thank Lloyd here. He's brought my attention to this material. I've only more recently started using it, but I have been trying to incorporate Sharia law into my more recent videos because unlike the Quran and Hadith, you can't really argue with it. It's quite unambiguous, and it is the authoritative interpretation of the Quran and Hadith. So I've started to use that to point out that this isn't just my interpretation. This is what the best and most respected scholars of Islam teach.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
moving on to the next issue here. This one is double standards in marriage. Specifically the idea that Muslim men are allowed to marry non-Muslim women, but but Muslim women are not allowed to marry non-Muslim men. His first point number one is kind of irrelevant. He says that it's not just any non-Muslim female, it's only Christians and Jews. Well, great, that doesn't change the double standard. So that was a totally irrelevant and pointless argument. Number two is that the reason for allowing men and not women is to protect the women's religion. So what do you think about that one, Lloyd? Do you think that women are incapable of maintaining their religion, and men only can maintain their own religion when marrying someone with a
I
different
think
religion?
that's a very sexist statement.
Yes,
That's very sexist, and also he's implying that men have to force women to do what is best for them because they know best for the women. So this, I think, it's just this thread of sexism that runs its way through Islam. Hopefully
yeah,
that.
definitely. Villainous says that this fixes the birth ratio problem. I guess so. Maybe this is why polygamy is only allowed for men, because they can take it captive women and marry them, as encouraged by Mohammed. Of course, they don't have to marry them if they don't want to. They can still have sex with them as long as they own the woman.
Yeah, I'm just thinking I might not be seeing some of the comments that you're mentioning.
That one just came in, but so your chat might be slightly behind.
Yeah,
I've also noticed that occasionally, like if I have it open in two windows, there'll be random isolated comments that are missing from one. I don't know.
okay.
I think it's. And then point number three, marriage to non-Muslims is discouraged in situations where Muslims are weak or in the minority in order to safeguard the religion of the children. Well, first of all, discouraged is not the same thing as forbidden. So that's also irrelevant. And two, this really shows why men are allowed to marry women and not the other way around, because it's all about power.
Also in
The man
theory,
has.
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that the man has the power to convert the woman, or at least make the children be Muslim. The woman has no such power.
Also in theory, they are only allowed in the Sharia to marry Christians and Christian and Jewish women. However, obviously women are not allowed the same privilege. Women can only marry Muslim men, so the man must convert. So a Muslim man can marry a woman before she converts. However, when they invaded North Africa, for instance, some of those places were not Christian. Take the Berbers. So did they not marry anybody? Because they certainly did. So in practice, they violate that rule on probably a daily basis. Because remember, if you look at Africa, you go into India, they are kidnapping Hindu girls and forcibly converting them or just marrying them. and then forcibly converting them. This is a common issue. So this is nothing to do with following the rule. They simply do it because they think they can.
Well, I guess they might say that they had converted the woman to Islam before they married her or something. I don't know. You know, you capture someone as a slave and you can rape her as much as you want. You don't have to marry her. Well, you know, at some point she might say, all right, so that I have some legal protection, I will agree to marry you and pretend to be a Muslim. Remember, all you have to do is say the Shahada. You don't have to mean it. You don't have to you don't have to know anything about Islam. All you have to do is say the Shahada and you're magically a Muslim. So pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah, really nuts.
Villainous said that not all his comments have turned up for him either. So some sort of YouTube bug apparently. But then he said that he said that this is love jihad, and that is quite accurate. And you know, if you do a news search for that phrase, love jihad, you'll see a number of articles on how this is ongoing in the present day in countries where Muslims are in the majority. They will often forcibly marry someone in the minority, usually a Christian family, to convert them to Islam.
Yeah. They're very concerned about the idea of weakness. It's really interesting that he speaks strategically here about weakness. He speaks in strategic terms, almost military sense. And this is the same in the Sharia.
Yeah, it's almost like Islam is all about military actions. Yeah, strange.
Yeah, I'm actually looking up something. I'm nearly there to find a reference in the Sharia, which might be very interesting to us. Okay, I'll get to that later. Yeah, shall we? Is there anything else on this page, or shall we move on?
While you're grabbing that, we have a comment from Pinpoint here who says, "Don't worry about all the details of Islamic scholarship. They all go back to the Hadith and Quran." And while that is nominally true, they do normally back their opinions by Hadith and Quran. If you're just looking at the Quran, you know, you can interpret that 100 different ways. It's very vague usually, despite claiming to be perfectly clear. And if you don't know the authoritative interpretation as decided by the scholars over Islam's history, then the Muslim will just rightfully or wrongfully will just say, you don't understand the Quran. You have no idea what you're talking about. On the flip side, though, if you try to force them to talk about Sharia, they'll just ignore that because they know they're trapped. So it's, you know, I think it's a fine line to walk. I don't want to totally ignore the Quran, but I don't want to be completely dependent on it either, because that plays right into the online Muslim polemicists' hands. They want to talk about the Quran and Bible only, because as long as you're just talking about the Quran, they know that you don't have any authority. You don't know what Islam is really teaching, and they can pretend that it means something totally different than what the scholars say it does. And you really have no way of showing them to be wrong, other than, you know, using logic and common sense, but those don't typically work that well, unfortunately.
On that point, they might refer to the Quran and the Sharia, but one, basic Muslims, there are 4 levels of knowledge in Islam. So the first level is where 99% of the Muslims are, called the ibadah, the plain level of meaning, the literal level of meaning. Someone like Yasir Qadhi is on a higher level. Would be someone like an imam. He is on a level they call the ishara. And then there's a level above that called the lataif, and a level above that called the haqaiq. So the senior scholars are at a different level of understanding, and your average Muslim is not allowed to know these things. And also things like things like the Hadith and the Quran are abrogated. They've been reinterpreted. Certain sentences say that, for instance, they have a thing called mantuq and mafhum we've discussed in past episodes. The Quran might say the sky is blue. Now, it might literally say those words, but that's been abrogated, because now what it means is the sky is pink. Right? So even though it says that, the scholars have it written elsewhere that the blue was abrogated by Allah and it's now pink. So even though it says that there, there's a reference in the Sharia or their tafsir where it says, actually, that word has now been changed, but we can't go and change it in the Quran, but it actually has to be reinterpreted this way. So there are multiple issues. And also, it doesn't matter what those hadith or Quran passages say. What matters is what the scholars say they say. What the scholars say they mean. And that is called the consensus, the ijma, the scholarly agreement. So we have to be careful. Are those passages still relevant? Are they abrogated? Are they, et cetera, et cetera? There's lots of issues around that. You cannot take these things at face value.
End Time says, I know a woman here in Germany who got divorced by her husband as soon as he had citizenship after the birth of her twins. I presume this would be a Muslim immigrant who wanted citizenship. And we'll say that Bilal defends easy divorce here. So, as far as Bilal is concerned, that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do.
Yeah.
I want to go on to the next slide.
Yeah, okay. Which is crazy. He starts
which is divorce. Hey, how about that?
He says divorce is not that easy, and then he ends up saying, actually, well, it is.
Yeah. So he's talking about the complaint that all a Muslim man has to do is say, I divorce you 3 times, and then they're divorced. And it's like, no, that's all wrong. Divorce is difficult in Islam. For one, you have to wait till the woman's done menstruating before you can divorce her. Oh, great. So there's a maximum of a 7-day waiting period. So generous.
Yeah.
And then number 2, he says that if the man is angry when he says it, it doesn't count. Oh, well, great. Yeah. He quotes the statement by the Prophet that says the divorce pronouncement is not valid at the time of seizure. He's added the word mental here, apparently, since it is in brackets. I haven't looked at the Arabic. I have no idea if the Arabic really does imply mental seizure or not, but let's just say for the sake of argument, it does imply that he's in a state of rage. Well, great. That doesn't in any way invalidate the general idea that you can easily divorce a woman. So that is rather silly. And then he talks about how you have to wait for 3 cycles to make sure the woman isn't pregnant before the divorce is final. Now, it's already considered divorce, but she can't leave the house until after 3 cycles. As he says, she is not supposed to leave her home, as is common among Muslims today. So great, you get that this is how divorce is not hard, or is supposedly hard in Islam. A woman is kept captive for 3 months after she's been divorced to make sure she's not pregnant. And of course, in reality, the reason she is kept captive is because if she is pregnant, then the children will belong to the husband. So he needs to know that. And if she leaves the house, maybe she'll have sex with another man, and then you won't know whose children they are. So she has to be kept captive. Disgusting.
Primitive thinking. Can I just answer something that JC is saying here?
Yep.
So JC, you just said, many learned sheikhs out there. Yes, the Qadis, just one, an American, the South Africans, Zimbabweans, the Pakistanis, have different positions on madhab or fiqh or aqidah. Look, this is the Reliance of the Traveler. This is the most famous and most common, most cited and most used Sharia manual, Islamic law manual in the world. Technically, the Sharia is the exegesis of the Quran and the Sunnah being the Hadith and the Sirah. But you'll notice that Muslims will almost never refer to the Sirah, to the biographies, effectively the Gospels of Muhammad, because those are incredibly embarrassing. And when they say that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John have a 12-minute time difference between the time of the resurrection, and that makes them all false, you got to try the Sirah. They have completely, utterly contradictory stories. But that's an issue for a different time. So you've mentioned here, so the 4 Sunni schools of Islamic law, the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali, are identical in approximately 75% of their legal conclusions. The remaining questions are just variances within a single family. The Umdat al-Salik is one of the finest and most reliable short works in Shafi'i jurisprudence. a school with perhaps fewer scholarly differences on rulings than others because its main resource is the recension of Imam Nawawi, the great 13th century Shafi Hadith scholar and jurisprudent who upgraded the works of previous generations in terms of authenticity and application of Hadith evidence. So there may be differences. Not all of those differences are authoritative. And so one opinion ultimately is the ultimate authoritative source. Two, in terms of those differences, for instance, if you leave Islam, every one of them agrees you have to die. The differences is how you die. Do they beat you to death with a stick? Do they starve you to death in your cell? Do they set you on fire and burn you to death? Do they drop rocks on your head? That's the differences. You're going to die, but just how you die. Do they chop off your head? Do they whip you to death? 6 or 7 differences, so take your pick. Also, in terms of differences, the Sharia has been harmonized. These differences are not as, there are other aspects that maybe you're not familiar with. There's a scholar called Sharani. He's a man who's famed. Now, if you read through the Sharia, it's like hyperlinks that link through different, it's not like a single consolidated book like the Talmud. The Sharia is the Talmud of Islam. So they will reference a line from a scholar and they'll reference a passage in a book, and then that scholar will reference another scholar's opinion. And it's a maze of these connections, like these hyperlinks. But Sharani is the man who harmonized the Sharia. Sharani said basically, essentially, because they don't see them as differences, they see them as variances, in that some Muslims are very pious and have enough self-control and discipline to be able to achieve the highest level of discipline and adherence to the law. But others, maybe they're not as smart, maybe they're not as capable, not as disciplined, and therefore they can do lesser because Allah is okay with that anyway. Because he's happy if you don't, let's say you can't pray 5 times a day, you can only pray 4 times because you got a bad knee and you can't bend over. So, that's okay. You're not the best of Muslims, but it's still acceptable. So they have these levels of acceptable adherence to the faith. And then they separate them into the best and what's still good enough to pass. They have the F plus, which is you just barely scrape over the line, and it's okay, and then you got the A's. So there's that. And then remember, not all of these opinions are all necessarily authoritative or followed. The Aqidah are just creeds. Those are like just different denominations, as it were, but those aren't very, very important, at least not to my knowledge. And fiqh is the exegesis of the Sharia. So the Sharia is the exegesis of the example of Muhammad and Allah from Quran. And the fiqh is the detailed. So for instance, the Sharia may say, and I'll finish in just a moment, the Sharia may say, thou shalt kill the infidel. That's the lesson from the Quran and the Sunnah. The fiqh is how, when, exactly, explicitly. And you'll find hundreds of pages explaining, well, what happens when it's during Ramadan? What happens when it's not Ramadan? What happens when it's war? What happens when he accidentally swears over your border? What if he deliberately? That is the fiqh. The fiqh is just the extended detail that applies to the Sharia. Sorry, Thaddeus, that was a diversion just to answer that question.
No, that was good. I think that JC supported our point well here when he said they, meaning Muslims, don't function like us. To understand them, we need to immerse ourselves in their world. And I that's what we're trying to do here with this look at the Dawa manual. It's fine and good to point out the errors, but what we're really trying to do is get inside his head, see how Bilal reasons through things. And he's a well-respected Muslim preacher and scholar, so we can assume that this is the normal way that Muslims behave. We did look at other Dawa manuals and they were all very similar. So the idea is, you get inside their head, you better understand how they think, and you can craft better arguments against Islam as a result.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we're doing. And I mean, I'm also very grateful to Thaddeus for giving me this opportunity to speak and to refine my thinking, and I've learned a lot from him as well, especially on the Bible and also just how to present these ideas and arguments better. I mean, and this particular section we're both new to. It's something that we're both learning as we're going as well.
And Pinpoint here says that to you, Lloyd, you are very knowledgeable. Thank you. I have to agree, David Wood often describes Sam Shamoun as the Assyrian encyclopedia. I think we need to start calling Lloyd the Sharia encyclopedia.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So we can go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Okay, yeah.
Which is finishing up divorce here. So as Lloyd previewed, this is his last point on the divorce issue. He says, in final analysis, divorce proceedings are somewhat easier than in Western countries. So in the end, he says, yeah, Muslims do have easy divorce. And then he tells us why. The theory being that marriage in Islam is primarily a contract and not a sacrament as originally perceived in the West, where it was considered unbreakable. So, you know, marriage is just a contract. That's all it is. It's
yeah, but
a
it's really just permission to legally have sex. That's what it is in Islam. It's literally the permission to legally have sex. They call it legal sexual relations. That's how the Sharia defines it: legal sexual relations.
yeah, yeah. It's pretty crazy stuff. That, you know, I'm sure many Muslim marriages are loving, but that is completely optional. In the end analysis, it's really just a contract. A woman agrees to provide sex. The man agrees to provide money in the form of, you know, a place to live, food on the table, and whatnot.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff. So then he goes on to talk about dress code, i.e., that Muslim women are forced to wear coverings, in particular the hijab, or if not the hijab, at least some sort of facial hair coverings. And his defense of this one really, really infuriates me. So he talks about the Western world, and then he says, in the United States, there's been a dramatic rise in the incidence of reported rape. Keep that in mind, reported incidents. In the US in the early 90s, reported incidents of rape crossed the 100,000 mark. Researchers estimated that the actual number was 7 to 10 times the number of women, as women are shy to report rapes. The two trends are closely interrelated. So women are being raped in the United States because they don't wear enough clothing. It's their own fault, according to Bilal. There's some logic errors too, like, you know, he's using raw numbers. The population has greatly increased, so of course the raw number is going to greatly increase. He's using reported rapes, not estimated total cases of rape. Of course, women, as their rights have increased, have become more likely to report when they're raped. And, you know, we looked for some statistics on rape in the Islamic world, and basically we couldn't find any because women are scared to death of reporting it.
And if they report rape, they are assumed guilty, and they can be flogged or killed or imprisoned, because that's how Islamic law works. You are guilty of rape unless you what 4 witnesses.
Yeah, so the man might end up getting a penalty, but the man might get a penalty for rape, but the woman will get a penalty for illegal sex outside of marriage, and she'll, in many cases, end up being punished just as severely as the man who raped her. Well, gee, I wonder why reported instances of rape aren't very high in the Middle East.
Yeah, you don't want to report it because, I mean, how many Westerners in the Middle East who've gone on holiday, for instance, in Dubai, there were a number of cases where women went to the police station, Western women who reported rape to the police in Dubai were then arrested for months, kept in jail for months, because they've had sex illegally. And unless they can prove with multiple witnesses that they were raped, they're guilty of promiscuity. And that's insane. That is crazy. Well, and a small point, back to something Bilal said about, remember in the previous episode, he says that Islam is the only religion that explicitly allows one wife. But then he contradicts it, and we forgot to mention this point, by saying, hold on, you can have 4. So he literally contradicts something from the previous chapter. And then not only that, he doesn't specify, doesn't say 4 wives, it says you can only have 4 wives at a time. You can literally say, in Saudi Arabia, you can send an SMS to your wife saying talak, talak, talak 3 times, done, as they love to do with the little hand gestures. Find a new wife, fresh meat. And this is what it is.
Yeah. And of course, there is no concept of rape within a marriage. You know, if a woman doesn't want to have sex and she's married to someone, keeping in mind that's just a legal contract, not anything loving. So there's no reason why the man might not force himself on her. That's not rape. That's perfectly legal.
Yeah, a woman in Islam is not allowed to deny sex with her husband.
So then he continues to try to defend the dress code, and he makes matters worse for himself. He says that the penalty in the Islamic State, meaning any state that has full Sharia law, is very severe for rape. And he claims it's in order to guarantee the protection of females. Then it's debatable, but let's just say that's true. And then he says, however, to allow women to expose themselves and then kill them, it kills those who react unduly is not practical. So basically he's saying if women don't wear proper covering and a man rapes them, that's, you know, the law can't do anything about that. That would be unpractical. Every man would want to rape a woman because she was wearing normal Western clothing. And I mean, they're so revealing that men can't control themselves. They're just, I guess they're just animals who have no ability to control their desires whatsoever.
Well, he's victim blaming, and he wants the circumstances that encourage rape should be removed from society. But then he also says that men are naturally promiscuous.
Yeah, and then he goes on to admit that, in fact, his argument is total bullshit because he says even in the society of the Prophet, 1,400 years ago, some women were molested and raped. So in actuality, his argument here supposedly is that coverings prevent rape, and then he admits that's not true. So he made this whole argument for absolutely no reason. He just contradicts himself. All he wanted to do is talk about how Western women deserve to be raped because they don't wear enough clothing. That's what I get out of the section anyway.
Yeah, but also, if this is a religious issue, these are social cultural issues. How is this religious? How he's indoctrinating people to dislike and hate our society, to find it deeply immoral. I mean, this is not, I don't recall getting this in Sunday school.
Yeah. I've never heard anything remotely like this in a Christian environment. I've never heard anyone be like, oh, you know that those Muslims, they are bad people. That's why you should believe Christianity is true. But I get this a lot online, and I'm starting to realize more and more that a large percentage of the common Muslims' confidence in Islam is being taught to hate people of different religions from birth. So they think themselves vastly superior. Let's take a couple comments from chat. Pinpoint asked, where's rape condemned in the Quran? It's not, as far as I know. You know, maybe someone can twist some verse to kind of sort of say it, but as far as I know, there's nothing remotely like condemning rape in the Quran or even the Hadith for that
No,
matter.
because there is no moral, there's only the concept of legal sex or illegal sex. That's it. Legal sexual relations or illegal. That's it. But there's no concept of rape. So if she's your slave, yeah, you can take her and she's not allowed to refuse. Remember, women are not allowed. We should maybe do a section on women one time, just discuss the Quran and women or Islam and women, but women are not allowed to refuse sex from their masters or husbands.
Quite right. Diane says that in the Bible, men are responsible for their own actions. Rape is his fault, even if a woman was totally naked. And I agree. The Bible believes in responsibility. Islam believes in what is legal and what is illegal, and responsibility, forget about it. You know, interestingly, a little while ago, David Wood and Apostate Prophet teamed up and they both did a video on a hadith where Muhammad apparently just saw a woman, just an ordinary woman walking down the street and started lusting after her. So he ran home and immediately demanded one of his wives have sex with him. And on one hand, it says something's really bizarre about Muhammad, but then apostate prophet who grew up in Turkey said that in his experience living there, if a woman, wearing full Islamic covering walks into a store and there's, so let's say a cafe, men are sitting at the tables, she doesn't do anything. She just comes in, buys her stuff and leaves. All their heads turn and look at her because they all are lusting after women so badly. So apparently the covering is not doing anything. The men are still filled with lust, and in fact more so than in the West.
That's interesting. And I mentioned something slightly off topic, but there is a common quote out of the Talmud that many people who are very much Jew hating will say, it's about you got to go to another city and sin there. There's some, it's got some sort of reference. Do you remember that quotation? Take yourself to another city and go and sin or go do evil over there. Well, when you read that passage, that story, it's like a hadith, basically. The Talmud's full of hadith. When you read that, it actually shows it's a rabbi, a student, who's actually a seminary student. And he was discovered to have been visiting prostitutes. And this brings shame on the rest of the rabbis. It brings shame on the profession, and it brings shame on the seminary. So they tell him, dress in black, cover yourself, cover your head, and go to another city and go and, when they say go do evil, actually if you read it, it says go and sin if you must, go sin elsewhere where no one knows you, but don't bring shame on your family, don't bring shame on your colleagues, don't bring shame on your community here, go somewhere else. And then they discuss it further, they say get it out of your system if you must. We prefer you didn't, but if you cannot control yourself, go somewhere else where no one knows you and try to get control over your urges. And then the student, out of shame, ends up killing himself. And you contrast that idea, which has ultimately been inherited into Christianity, ideas of that nature, maybe not that specific one, but these ideas of how we should control ourselves and the shame involved with this idea of Islam. Those are worlds apart.
Definitely crazy stuff. So the next topic he covers is unfair inheritance, how the Quran prescribes that men receive twice the inheritance of women. He first makes this nonsense claim that the right for women to inherit and own property was only given to the women in the West at the turn of the century. Well, first, he'll end up contradicting himself when he says that in the West, people can give their money to whoever they want, which obviously means that they could always have given it to their daughter if they wanted. But as far as I know, the vast majority of Western cultures have allowed women to own property. I'm not really familiar with any. Now, it was rare. I agree that it was relatively rare for women to own property, but I don't know of any society that made it illegal for women to own property. So he's just basically making this up.
Yeah, that's very much true. They speak of the rights given to women in Islam. Well, we don't really know what the rights were. We know they were supposedly, in theory, men were burying girls. They didn't like the girls. They would bury them in the desert and kill them. But then again, when you read through these stories in Hadith, where they discuss this society prior to Muhammad's advent, men had 20 wives. So if they were killing all the daughters and burying them in the desert, how could men have 20 wives? That doesn't make any sense. So there's a lot of untruth there. And again, he makes assertions. He doesn't provide citations or any sort of decent facts. And when he did provide facts, he didn't provide facts about the Middle East. So this is just propaganda.
Yeah, basically. And the next line actually is an excellent example of how it's propaganda, because he says in the West, a person can legally write in their will giving all their wealth to their dog or cat and exclude their wife, children, and other relatives. First of all, I doubt that's true. I doubt there's any jurisdiction that will allow you to give your wealth to your cat or your dog. But even if it was true, no sane person would actually do that. So it's totally irrelevant. He's just making up nonsense to make it look like the Western legal system is illogical, when in fact, no one would ever do that.
Yeah, he's finding ways to disparage Western civilization, Western culture, and Christians when we are being factual and he's just making these broad statements which are loosely based on the truth at best.
So then he goes on to explain why men have unfair inheritance, and is another one of his many, many sexist statements. He says, in Islamic society, men are responsible for the maintenance of women. And that's why men get more inheritance, because, they have to pay for all those women. I guess women are incapable of maintaining themselves. They need a male protector at all times.
Yeah, and then he goes on. So he says unfair inheritance, and he says, well, it's not really unfair, but then based on the male role, Islamic law awards the son twice the portion of the daughter. So where's the fairness? He still doesn't quite explain this. He tries to justify why it's unfair rather than explaining how this is fair.
Indeed.
I mean, he has the additional responsibility of looking after his sister and mother. Well, what if his sister is 28, has a job?
Yeah, and he's 14.
Exactly, but he could be 7 and he inherits everything. His mom is 50, his sister is 25, and you've got this 7-year-old lording it over the adults. That's insane. Yeah, welcome to the Sharia.
Pinpoint asked, why are so many Muslims fleeing to the West? And I think it's pretty clear that they don't like what Islam, they don't like the practical outcomes of what Islam teaches, yet somehow they don't equate that with what Islam is. Man, this government's so oppressive because they're instituting Sharia law. Let's go to the West where you're not oppressed and institute Sharia law. I don't know.
Yeah, but one would think you need to be careful when you think about that as well. It's sure that there are those that aren't happy, but those are the really, really educated ones who want a better life financially, socially, and so on. But then if you look, the hijrah is a form of jihad. That means migrating for Allah is a form of jihad. If you die in the process of migrating from an Islamic country to a non-Islamic country, you earn paradise just like any jihadi. And also, Saudi Arabia, for instance, there are 2,000 plus mosques in Germany now. They were, 10 years ago, there was like a dozen. Now suddenly you've got 2,000. They are migrating to spread Islam. 72% of these migrants into Europe are illiterate in their own language. How are these doctors, lawyers, and engineers? So you got to start thinking. Remember, these people are taught to go out there and to colonize. So there's this very uncomfortable issue about these teachings, which we have never really delved into, and which we lack the political will and to discuss these very awkward questions. And what if this is just colonization?
Yeah, good perspective there. Here in the United States, we don't face this as much, but in Europe, it's a big problem. Definitely something to keep in mind, that not every quote unquote refugee is really trying to escape. Some are actively trying to spread Islam by their immigration.
There's a bit of a spat happening about the start of Islam. Where Islam's there's from Diane, there is a fair amount of evidence that shows that Islam definitely has roots in heretical Christianity. I wouldn't call it. I don't even want to call it Christianity, but certainly Gnostic heresies. Because those Gnostic heresies are deliberately anti-Christian. They're a reaction to Christianity and seek to refute and to correct it. However, it also has a very strong base within the Judaic scriptures. So within the corruption of the Torah, corruption of the Talmudic scriptures. In fact, most of it is from the Talmudic scriptures, and then a portion of Gnostic heretical teachings. So yes, I mean, that definitely is part of it.
Yeah, just a little off topic, but just to briefly summarize my position. For the majority of my videos, I just take the Islamic narrative for granted and show how it self-contradicts. My actual opinion is that Islam has very little to do with a historical figure named Mohammed, that it developed a century to 2 centuries after he died, that these views were projected back on him. It was done in a hurry in order to wage war against to unite the Arabs to wage war against populations. It primarily was not a religious movement. It was primarily a political. So they just basically copied it and pasted, to use a modern terminology, they took a bunch of existing stories, attributed them to Muhammad, put them in the Quran. They didn't really care if they made any sense. They were just trying to create a narrative to unite the people to wage war. And as a result, it is, in a sense, founded on Christian ideas, in that they just copied a bunch of stuff. They didn't really necessarily even understand what they were copying, but they copied it because it sounded good. They pretended to be in the line of Christian and Jewish prophets, and made up a new prophet to justify the war they were trying to
Well,
wage.
by the 800s, I mean, within 100 years of Muhammad's death, these guys were 20 miles from Paris, right? And I don't think that Europe had invaded them at that point. They invaded Europe. I mean, they'd conquered Spain. They were just short of Paris, and they got kicked out by Charles Martel. So they needed a cohesive story, a narrative to bind their empire, and that's, I think, where the Muhammad narrative was created as a religion to give them a cohesion, which they lacked at that point.
And just to summarize it, Diane, we agree that these ideas were not true Christian ideas. It's just convenient to label them as Christian-like ideas or heretical Christian ideas. We agree that they were in no way the true teachings of Christianity.
Yeah.
So getting back to the point, I forget who it was, but someone earlier said that women are half as intelligent as men in Islam, and here we are. The value of female in Islam. So he quotes the famous Quran verse that the witness of two women is equal to one man. Then he tries to make it only apply to a business contract, and says that because women aren't familiar with business, I wonder why, because they're oppressed by men, but let's ignore that. They may forget some of the details of the business contract. First of all, I'm pretty sure that memory is unrelated to being familiar with a subject. But much more importantly, Muhammad is the best interpreter of the Quran, and he tells us exactly what this verse means. Do you have that hadith we can pull up?
Which one was that again? Just
where he says, the one on how women are worth half as much. He said, I can paraphrase it if you don't have the.
Yeah, what was it now? Sorry, I lost my place here.
I'll just paraphrase it. It's fine. I'm sure anyone can find it if they need it. So basically, Muhammad passes a group of women. He says, "Oh, women, I've seen that the majority of the inhabitants of hellfire are you." They ask why, and he says, "Because you're deficient in intelligence and religion." And then they ask, "Why are we deficient in intelligence?" And he says, "Because the Quran says that the witness of two women is equal to one man." So not a hint of anything related to business here, just Muhammad saying that women are unintelligent.
Yeah, they have deficiency in their intelligence. I mean, this is incredible. Imagine this was said by Jesus.
Yeah, that's all we'd ever hear about.
Yeah, incredible. I mean, just if we did this comparison. Yeah, and also David Wood did a show on this, and there's been numerous other examples online. But if you add up these statistics at the bottom here, these fractions, they don't add up to 100%. They add up from anything from 103.5% to 108%. Depending how you do the maths, and it doesn't add up to 100%. So Allah was maths challenged. Besides having two right sides or two right hands or one hand that was right-handed, who knows? But yeah.
Pinpoint said that this is circular reasoning. Indeed. So it's true because the Quran says it. Well, why is it true? Well, the Quran says it. That's basically.
Yeah, it basically makes it canon that women are forgetful, women are weak, women are incapable, women are unintelligent.
And this is his supposed defense. Keep in mind, this isn't a Christian saying this. This is Bilal attempting to defend it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just.
And then he goes on. He says there is an exception though. Sometimes women's witness is worth that of a man. And specifically, he cites an example where a woman was paid as a wet nurse for 2 children, which in Islam makes them considered siblings. And she testified that she had nursed both of them. Well, great. Or as Bilal puts it, in the areas of feminine expertise, the witness of a single woman is sufficient. And what is female expertise? Nursing children, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the Sharia says in section 025.3, a people that leave its leadership to a woman will never succeed. That is now part of the Sharia, that is Islamic law, and that is based on a hadith by Muhammad. So a people that leave its leadership to a woman, well, this is in the reliance of the traveler. So if you leave your leadership to a woman, you will never succeed. Well, there you go.
Yeah, and I just think this is hilarious that this is his defense, that women, when they're talking about their own area of expertise, nursing children is the only example he can give. This is presumably the best example he could find in all of the Sirah, is that at some point some woman was allowed to testify that she nursed 2 children, and they didn't need someone to verify that she nursed those children. Wow, so progressive. Such great equality there. Pinpoint pointed out that in actuality, women are better at remembering details, and I actually believe that's true. I believe that there are studies that
oh yeah, man,
women have better memories than men on average.
You remember when you yeah, something like JC, they talked about the many monks who resorted to Platonism, which was Greek philosophy. Well, look, the thing is, there were many Greeks. There was Aristotle as well, who technically was an antagonist to Plato. Plato was very much sophist in his leanings and Gnostic, to some degree Gnostic, whereas Aristotle was very much about logic and logos. So when you say Greek philosophy, you have to be more specific.
So we've now reached the final point, and the first thing I want to point out on this is, he spent all this time, like pages and pages, talking about most of what was women's rights issues, and then he gets to the claim that Islam was spread by the sword, and he has one whole paragraph to say on it, and that's it.
Forcible conversion is prohibited. Populations are free to maintain. We've done more than one episode on demi-status and jihad, which should I bring up something on that?
Yeah, go ahead. While you're bringing that up, there's 2 episodes on my channel specifically on jihad, and we did, I believe, 3 shows on Sonia Azam 7's channel on demi-status in Islam. So, we've done 5 shows on this subject.
Okay, yeah, so that's numerous hours of notes on this lie that he is telling, but the thing is, they're lying to Muslims. And these Muslims believe these lies, and then they think we're lying when we tell them that that's not the truth. That's not the history. I probably have to cancel out of this one. So this is the Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun, right? We've covered this. This is just to discuss this issue because he's egregiously lying here with regards to, it's crazy how this can just get worse and worse. In the Ibn Khaldun is the greatest historian that Islam ever created. He is considered, even in the West, as an incredible scholar. He was highly, highly qualified as an imam, as a jurist in Islam, highly educated, and he is the creator of what we call sociology today. So in the Muslim community, the holy war is a religious duty because of the universalism of the Muslim mission and the obligation to convert everybody to Islam, either by persuasion or by force. Therefore, the caliphate and royal authority are united in Islam. There's no separation of church and state. So the person in charge can devote the available strength to both of them at the same time, which is the obligation to convert everybody to Islam. The other religious groups did not have a universal mission, and holy war was not a religious duty to them, save only for the purposes of defense. So yeah, so we are not under obligation to gain power over other nations, as is the case with Islam. They are merely required to establish their religion among their own people. This is the finest historian Islam has ever produced. And I'm not sure how high up in the rankings Bilal Philips is, but let me go to slide 10 here, let's just to briefly go through this, right? There's an obligation to command the right and forbid the wrong, right? So let's skip forward a little bit. We don't have time to do every single slide, so I'm just going to grab a handful. So jihad, right? There's a scriptural basis for jihad, and it means to war against non-Muslims. This is now Muslims will always say jihad just means struggle. No, it does not. It has a legal definition. It is a legal term. So you can have the dictionary definition, which means struggle, and that is correct. It is also false. However, jihad means in legal terms in the Sharia, means to make war on non-Muslims. It is etymologically derived from the word mujahada, signifying warfare to establish the religion. Then the author who translated this book inserts his own views here. This does not appear in the original Arabic of this Umdat al-Salik, or the Reliance of the Traveler. The author inserts this, and this is it's a false hadith. One of Islam's greatest scholars tells us this is a false hadith, right? That it is the lesser jihad, blah, 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 right? So this lesser jihad does not conform with the hadith collections. And so we have the best scholars of Islam, like Ibn Taymiyyah, saying that this hadith has no source. Nobody in the field of Islamic knowledge has narrated it. Jihad against the disbelievers is the most noble of actions. It is the most important action for the sake of mankind. So Islam is under obligation to make us all Muslims by force. Fighting is prescribed for you, right? So the scriptural basis for jihad prior to the scholarly agreement are these Quranic verses. Fighting is prescribed for you. Slay them wherever you find them and fight the idolaters utterly. And I've been commanded to fight people until they testify that there is no God but Allah. And if they say it, they have saved their blood and possessions from me. This is the Sharia, right? Details concerning jihad are found in the accounts of the military expeditions of the Prophet. It doesn't say he struggles to overcome his obesity, right? And the final reference here, the obligatory character of jihad. It's a communal obligation. So explain to me how, right? And there are two possible states in respect to non-Muslims. The first is when they're in their own countries, in which case jihad is an obligation. And this is what the author is speaking of when he says it's a communal obligation upon the Muslims. They must attack us in our own lands. And jihad is obligatory for everyone, and they're obliged to fight us. I just thought that I'll finish there. That should explain how he is distinctly just lying about this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of his arguments were nominally true, but totally irrelevant. And this one, however, is just outright false.
Yeah, we've done an entire episode or two on that where I go through in terrifying detail about that. And I could have done much longer shows. Yeah, so Islam encourages scientific advancement. Then why are the entire Islamic world produces less books per annum than Spain on its own does? Why is that? Spanish authors write and publish more books than the entire Islamic world combined.
Indeed. And, we have a number of awards for recognizing the best scientists in the world, the most obvious, of course, being the various Nobel Prizes. Less than 1% of all Nobel Prizes have been won by Muslims, and those tend to be in, humanitarian type fields, like the Nobel Prize for Peace or for Literature or something. I could be wrong. There might be one or two exceptions, but as far as I know, no Muslim has won a Nobel Prize in a hard science.
No, not that I know of. I'm not aware of that. If you look at their representation proportionally, I mean, it is minuscule. It is absolutely minuscule. Considering that rational thought is effectively banned. Thought must conform with Sharia, as we've discussed in past shows.
Yeah, and just one more thing on this jihad lie here. He repeats the claim that Islam spread to Indonesia and other places by trade. In my upcoming video, I will have a clip from Yasser Qadi who says that this is at best a half-truth, but basically it's just a lie. And Muslims should stop repeating it because it's a lie. And in reality, it wasn't necessarily spread by the sword. What happened is the political leader of the country, you know, the king or whatnot, converted to Islam, and then everyone else was forced to legally and or socially, but not through violence. But it certainly wasn't voluntary. So he basically, and he also points out that this is the, even ignoring that this is the rare exception, that all other times Islam spread by the sword. It's only one or two countries where it was at least somewhat peaceful that it spread to. Everywhere else, it was military expedition.
You know, that's just so false. I mean, how does he justify these statements? I mean, let me bring up this one again. You can see from the Muqaddimah, Islamic War by Sea. The non-Arab nations became the servants of the Arabs and were under their control, right? They wished to wage the holy war by sea. They embarked the army and fighters to fight against the unbelievers across the sea. And he was desirous of waging the holy war. From there, the conquest of Sicily was achieved in the days of Ziyadat, right? So looking into another's house without permission, you are legally allowed under the Sharia here in P75.22 to throw a man's eye out with a rock if he stares into your house without permission. You know, this is just a very short glimpse into their sources.
Well, and as I pointed out originally, he barely says anything on this subject, which I think is quite telling. You know, he feels uneasy making these claims. He went through 12 points, taking multiple pages on polygamy, but he has one short paragraph, 1 point on jihad, and it's not even true.
Yeah, yeah. And it's crazy. So look, on some of the issues that I know really well, it's easy to discuss this and to refute it. But in some of the other things, it's such gobbledygook that it's really hard to wrap your head around and try to explain how and why it's wrong, morally, socially, and it's really difficult social issues. But I mean, we should reject it, and we should study these, take these apart, and learn to really provide strong counter arguments.
Absolutely. And we hope that you take this material that we've gone over. I hope that it better gives you an insight to how Muslims are trained to think, and keep in mind, Muslims doing Dawa are the most devout Muslims. These are the Muslims that really, really love Islam and really want other people to spread it to other people. So, you know, this is kind of like the best of the best, so to speak, Muslims. This is what they learn. So, you know, keep that in mind. This is how Muslims are taught to think. This is how I put it in the thumbnail, is that it's either deflection or excuses or outright lies. So strategy number one, you deflect, you bring up something unrelated. As we saw in the part 2 of this series, Bilal repeatedly recommends the Muslim not engage in discussions of difficult issues, but change the subject. You know, something difficult comes up, just start talking about Muhammad. Oh, they're criticizing Muhammad, start talking about the Quran. They're criticizing the Quran, start talking about how Islam has the best moral values, or, you know, whatever. Just, it doesn't matter what you're talking about. If you get trapped, change the subject.
Yeah, and these entire arguments are vague gobbledygook.
Right. So that would be the deflection. The excuses are things like Islam didn't invent polygamy. So what? That's irrelevant. You know, just bring up irrelevant things. Or one of the ones we see constantly online is your priests rape children. Yeah, and we condemned them for that. You know, people do bad things sometimes, and we condemn them for them. We don't pretend they don't exist. I could easily go online, just do a search for imam or sheikh accused of child abuse, find numerous news stories, and start pasting those on every Islamic channel. But you know, it's totally pointless. It doesn't say anything about Islam necessarily. The fact that they cover it up might say something, and Obviously, when the Catholic Church tried to cover it up, that was a grave sin, and we now acknowledge that was a grave sin. But it's just an excuse. It's just a distraction. And then, of course, outright lies. You know, if you don't have anything better, just make something up. If they're trying to tell you that Islam is violent, say, no, that's just the terrorists. Islam means peace. That's what the word Islam means. So obviously Islam must be peaceful. Or, you know, Islam never spread by the sword, only spread by trade. What are you talking about? It was only defensive battles. Somehow the entirety of North Africa was conquered in one generation by the peaceful defensive spread of Islam. I'm not sure how you're defending territory where there weren't any Muslims yet, but go figure, it's defense somehow.
Yeah, I mean, they entered Europe aggressively, conquered Spain. There were no Muslims, and there was no defense. They attacked.
Exactly. So, you know, those are the three basic strategies of Islam. If you're aware of those, it'll help you, you know, when they try to distract by bringing up some gross misinterpretation of the Bible, just say, we're not talking about the Bible, and get back on subject. They try to bring up how excellent a moral example Muhammad was while you're talking about how Islam allows polygamous marriages. Say, no, we're talking about polygamous marriages. Don't change the subject.
Yeah, I want to mention something. Diane said something. She says, Islam doesn't have to justify lying, anything goes, and so on. Now, look, that's an opinion, which is correct. It's still an opinion. What is more important? Remember I mentioned the scholar called Sharani a little earlier. This is the man that harmonized the Sharia, the differences between the four schools of jurisprudence, technically five schools if you include the Jafari school from the Shia, which is recognized as well. Now, he actually came, so in his book, when he harmonized and all the scholars refer to him as the expert in the field, when he harmonized the Sharia, he came up with 6 basic lessons from the Sharia, 6 things the pillars of the Sharia. 2 of them I've got mentioned here, number 4, where he says that the Sharia teaches us, and Allah's lesson and Muhammad's lesson to us, are that necessities permit the forbidden. In other words, do what you have to, right? Necessities, if you have to win, then you can lie, you can eat pork, you can do whatever you need to, right? Because making Islam win, conquering territory and converting everyone is a necessity in Islam. It is a necessity. So therefore, they can do whatever is forbidden by their own laws. They can break every single rule. And the second most important one is the aims are more important than the means. This is quoted out of his book, right? The Al-Mizan al-Kubra. The aims are more important. Basically translated, this just means the ends justify the means. So Islam, it is legal, and we see this in the Hiyal episode. I'd recommend you watch Hiyal, the episode on Hiyal, which is the actual major form of Islamic lying, the major form of deception that underlies all deceit in Islam. We discussed this at length, but they can do literally anything. They can break every single law, every promise, every oath, every single aspect of Sharia can be broken as long as they win. I'll stop there.
Excellent. So we have I think we'll do one more show on Bilal's Dawa manual. The next section, he gives 80 strategies for doing Dawa. It's rather silly. It's like make posters, write Islamic slogans on your car, stuff like that. So, I mean, if you're interested, check that out. We're not going to go through
the conversation. Why do you worship that idol?
Oh yeah. He gives 7 talking points to start a conversation. They're a bit dated. Like, what do you think about the war in Iraq? So some of them are like that. But then one of them is like, why do you wear an idol around your neck? And it's like, oh yeah, that really is going to have some good conversation when you go up to a Christian. Who is wearing a cross? Why are you wearing an idol? It's like, what? And you know, some of them are just like, what do you think about Muslims? So, you know, if you're interested, check that out. It's not particularly interesting though. It's like, and then the next section after that is how to do Dawa to atheists, agnostics, and deists. Since that isn't our focus, we're not going to devote a show to that. But check that out if you're interested. In large portion, he basically just makes generic arguments for the existence of God and somehow equates that with Islam being true. And then the final section is how to do Dawa to Christians. That'll be the subject of our next show. So we will see some of the interesting ways he tries to manipulate Christians into giving a shahada. And of course, we know that this is actually happening in reality because lots and lots of people are more or less tricked into doing shahada. And then the Islamic organizations say, great, we got another convert. Let's count that as a statistic. And then a week later, they don't show up to mosque. They never show up, and then they leave Islam. So they were never really a convert in the first place. Or, they nominally did convert. They go to a mosque a few times, and then they're like, this is nothing at all like what I was told it is. I'm out of here. I'm leaving. And they can't do anything about it in the West because, you can't enforce apostasy laws. So it's something like 75% leave within 1 year and like 90% leave within 5 years or something like that of converts to Islam.
Yeah.
Or so-called converts. I'd say probably half never even converted at all in reality. They just said a shahada to get the person who was annoying them away from them and then never thought about Islam again.
Yeah. So yeah, to our listeners, to our audience, I mean, really appreciate you guys. The comments, the questions are really good. But what do you guys get out of this? And what other subjects would you like us to cover? As Thaddeus said, we will do another episode, which is Dawa to Christians. We need to unpack that. But what are the other things that you think are important? What are the, in terms of trends or things that are unaddressed? And or are we doing okay? And what do you guys get out of this? How do you use it? Just like to get your thoughts as feedback. Put those in the chat or in the comments.
And just to wrap it up here, Pinpoint said that Islam means submission and Salam means peace, which is correct. I was trying to give an example of a false slogan when I said that Islam means peace, so Islam must be peaceful, because of the fact the word does not mean peace, it means submission. But just so everyone's clear, Islam means submission. Let's see. And Pinpoint also said the sign of a call is no matter what it takes, we need to win, and that is exactly what Islam teaches. There's very little about change of heart. It's all about nominally getting someone into the army. Obviously Islam struggles a little with this in the modern day since it's not usually literally an army, but originally it was literally an army. You get the person on your side, and that's all that really, and then you keep them on your side by any means necessary, and that's what's really matters. It doesn't really matter what they believe. It doesn't really matter if they have any change of heart, as long as they are on your side fighting the war for you, giving you more political power, you're winning and you're advancing Islam. Any final thoughts from you?
There was a question from or comment from End Time saying, what is going on Sharia-wise within our countries? And End Time said the Muslim Brotherhood, and then Mojo did, is it reasonable to dismiss the Islamic history as Mohammedans tell it and piece together with what can be known from actual evidence? So is it reasonable to dismiss the Islamic history as? I think, yeah. Look, I mean, there's a couple of guys that are doing fantastic work. The one is Jay Smith, who's doing the history, right? He summarized the history of all those scholars that came before him. So he's pieced all of that together. And then, of course, you have Dan Gibson. And between those two, I think you've got that sewn up, that history is definitely unraveling. And I personally am of the view that Dan Gibson's contention that Petra is the source of Islam and the original Mecca seems to match the geography and the statements within the Quran and Hadith, where they mention that these people of the Bible are close to you. Well, Petra is in Jordan, whereas Mecca is 1,000 kilometers further south. So there's no way Muhammad could have met them every day, spoken, walked over to them, etc. So yeah, and maybe I can just do a quick screen share again. This is something, Thaddeus, what do you think if we did a discussion on the Muslim Brotherhood and the psychological warfare?
Yeah, I think that'd be a great subject. I
Um,
don't know a lot about it, so you'd have to do most of the talking, but I'd
yeah,
like to do it for sure.
yeah, sure. Very brief introduction. The Muslim Brotherhood entered America in 1963. They have expanded into dozens and dozens, probably 100 organizations that are all just fronts for their intentions. A cache of documents, 80 boxes of documents, was discovered in the early 90s. It was captured by the FBI when a man was discovered filming the supports of one of the bridges in the States. And they thought this was suspicious, especially, why are they trying to film the struts and supports of the bridge? Anyhow, this is very briefly their five-phase plan for an infiltration and an American coup. Now, 9/11 was the opening shot in a 21-year plan by Al Qaeda, 7 phases, 3 years per phase, ending in 2021. Right? It was a 7-phase plan where the uprising, the overthrow of the US government, occurs in 2021. The Muslim Brotherhood is working on a 100-year plan ending in 2028. Al Qaeda, the head of Al Qaeda is a Muslim brother. The head of ISIS is a Muslim brother. And unfortunately, Al Qaeda just wanted to move things along a little bit, move a little faster, right? They have the same general plans. This is their plan. Phase one, phase of discrete and secret establishment of elite leadership. This phase has already been implemented in America. This is from their leadership documents. The leader fled, right? Many of their members have been arrested, are still in jail. Their leadership fled when they could, and they captured these documents. These were what is captured by the FBI. So they have established a secret establishment of elite leadership in the States. This is back in the 80s already. Phase two, the gradual appearance in the public scene and exercising and utilizing public activities, and it has succeeded in implementing this stage. It also succeeded in achieving important goals such as infiltrating sectors of the government, gaining religious institutions, public support, and establishing a shadow government secret within the United States government. Utilizing mass media currently in progress. This one has been succeeded. They've succeeded already. Open public confrontation with the government through exercising political pressure. And then the fifth would be to seize power and establish the Islamic nation, but training on the use of weapons domestically. Now, I can tell you, Antifa is very much involved with Islamic groups, with the Muslim Brotherhood. There is an actual poster, see if I can find it. There's an actual poster that CARE uses, and Antifa, when I watched the Project Veritas expose on the Antifa training, Antifa were actually utilizing this poster by CARE. Build a wall of resistance. Do not talk to the FBI. Basically, do not cooperate with the law, with the police. And so, yeah, these things are happening. Be aware of it, and I can discuss this at length another time. But we are definitely looking at a plan where there are groups working to overthrow the U.S. government.
Very good. A couple people mentioned Sneakers Corner in the chat as a third person looking at the historical origins of Islam. Considering I've done 4 interviews with Sneakers, or actually 5, 4 on my channel and 1 on his, I definitely recommend checking him out. He's a good friend of mine. We talk sometimes. So definitely check out his channel as well.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That's it. It's been a while, so let's.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. Look forward to the conclusion of the Dawa series in about 2 weeks. Of course, exact time and date to be announced, but should be about 2 weeks from now. In the meantime, look for a new video from myself sometime this week, and check out Lloyd, see if he's putting out any shorter videos on his channel as he does from time to time. If I didn't do so already, I'll put a link to his channel in the description. I think it's probably already there, but I'll put it in a pinned comment as well. And I'll put a link to Jay Smith, Dan Gibson, and Sneakers Corner as well, since we talked about them. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, whether it is just beginning or whether your day is coming to an end, depending on what part of the world you live in. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, guys. Good night.